Welcome to an all-new StepZen community update. This month, June, I'd like to show some of the new things we've been working on, such as converting your REST API to GraphQL directly from the StepZen dashboard, and also a collaboration we started with Neo4j. And at the end of this community update, I even have something that might interest you if you're looking to deploy StepZen on a different cloud environment. Previously, you might have seen the website rest2graphql.io. At StepZen, we always try to make our products as easy to use for everyone as possible. So we created rest2graphql to make it really easy to create a GraphQL API based on your existing REST API. What we've done today is we've added this functionality to the StepZen dashboard. So let's see what this looks like. So this is the old website rest2graphql.io, and from this website you're able to quickly convert any REST API to GraphQL in just a few clicks. It has support for your endpoint, of course, multiple HTTP methods such as get and post, and then there are things like query params, headers, JSON, path params, all these kind of things. Of course, you can already do this using the StepZen CLI, but we know some developers like to use a GUI instead, and that's why we generated rest2graphql.io. But starting today, we already have this functionality added to the StepZen dashboard. So no longer do you need to go to a separate tool. Instead, you can build a GraphQL API based on your existing REST also through the StepZen dashboard. So this comes on top of the already existing support we have for the StepZen CLI. From the StepZen dashboard, you can find a page called Getting Started. So this Getting Started page will help you to build StepZen GraphQL APIs quickly by selecting your backend. And one of those possible backends starting today is convert REST to GraphQL. So this is all the functionality you already saw from rest2graphql.io, but now built into the StepZen dashboard. Of course, you can find other things here like MySQL or Postgres, Snowflake, or use any of the generic connectors that will bring you to that will give you more examples on how to build StepZen for these existing endpoints. So let's go to convert REST to GraphQL. As you can see, it's pretty similar to what we saw for the website rest2graphql.io, but this time it's all inside the StepZen dashboard. You can insert your endpoint, select the HTTP method, and then add additional stuff like query params, headers, JSON, or path params. As you can see, there already is a path param for what we have here. And the endpoint we're trying to convert is called jsonplaceholder.typicode.com. So the only thing we need to convert this to GraphQL is following the steps in the StepZen dashboard. Once we press next step, the first thing you need to do is set up the StepZen CLI. I mentioned briefly before that we like to help developers build GraphQL APIs, and automatically you do this through the StepZen CLI. So on this page you can find all the steps you need in order to install the StepZen CLI on your computer, and then subsequently convert the REST API endpoint to GraphQL. So from a new project, you will need to run npm install global StepZen. You need to log into your StepZen account, and you can do all this from a VS Code project. So I've already set up a fresh VS Code project that we can use for this scenario. In VS Code, I need to open a terminal, and in this terminal I need to have Node installed. So let me see which version I have. I'm running Node version 16. And let me see if I've already installed StepZen by running the command stepzen whoami, and this lets me know that I've set it up with a public account. So let me quickly log into my StepZen account so I'm able to use all the features StepZen has. So after adding my credentials, I'm able to run StepZen on my machine and start converting my REST API to GraphQL. So let's head back to the StepZen dashboard where we can generate the commands to import the REST API that we gave in our previous step and then convert it to a GraphQL API. So we've done step 1, 2, 3. Let's go to this next page where we can see all the steps to generate a new endpoint. So first I need to set up a new endpoint name, for example, API/getting started. I then need to import my configured REST backend, and then I can run StepZen start to start a new project. So the StepZen import curl command is a command that I can also use directly from the terminal. What the StepZen dashboard does, it will help you to make this a little bit easier by providing you the command that you can just copy paste. So if I copy paste this and go back to my VS Code project, I can run this. It will take the REST endpoint and then convert it to a GraphQL API. So my schema will look like this. I have this type code endpoint. I have a new directory called type code query, and my StepZen schema is pointed towards this newly generated schema. So the only thing I need to deploy this is run StepZen start. This will deploy my endpoint and make it available for me and other people to query. Of course, if you have my StepZen API key, or I can actually decide to make it public as well. In your terminal, you can see a curl that you can try out to test this response. You can also go directly to the dashboard and then try out your GraphQL endpoints from there. Of course, there are more things you can do. So let's go back to step 1 and try and convert another REST API endpoint. Of course, we went with a REST endpoint the first time. We can also go for a more complex one. Let's say maybe we have headers we like to append, or a JSON body, or we like to set up the path params to work slightly different. So these are all things we can do to make the endpoint a bit more advanced. So I really like everyone to go to the StepZen dashboard and try out this new functionality, because there's much more you can do as to what I've shown you in this video. As always, we really like to have your feedback. So if you haven't joined our Discord channel just yet, you can find a link to join our Discord channel in the description of this video. Let's head over to the second topic for today's community update. I mentioned I wanted to show you what we've done with converting REST APIs to GraphQL APIs into a dashboard. And the second thing I'd like to show you is how to work with data from Neo4j and generate a GraphQL API for this data using StepZen. Are you building GraphQL APIs for a graph database? So recently StepZen started to collaborate with Neo4j, making it possible to use a GraphQL API built with the Neo4j GraphQL library and then use it together with other data sources such as REST APIs, Postgres databases, or maybe even other GraphQL APIs, and bring them together in one large API using StepZen. And for this video, I'm going to show you how to work together, how to take your data from Neo4j and have it work together with other data sources using StepZen. So let's dive into VS Code, where I've set up a new example project from the StepZen GitHub repo. But first, let's have a look at the Neo4j website. On here you can find a blog post that covers how to set up a new GraphQL API with Neo4j, then introspect this GraphQL API using StepZen, and then 3, bring together this introspected GraphQL API together with other data sources such as a REST API. And in this blog post, we're using the New York Times API. And if you don't know, they have a public API that is protected by an API key. So you have to create a new account for the New York Times and then request your free API key. And by requesting this free API key, you're able to get access to their entire database of reviews of movies, concert, theater stuff, and basically everything they have on their website. But for this example, we'll be using 2 datasets. The first dataset is a Neo4j dataset to get movie information. And all of this is right here in the blog post. And then the other dataset we'll be using is coming from the REST API of the New York Times to get reviews about a certain movie. So all the information is in here, but you can also find this information in the StepZen GitHub repo that's filled with all our code examples. And I've checked out one of these code examples in a new VS Code project. So this is the example of using StepZen together with Neo4j. And again, if you'd like to know how this is built from scratch, have a look at the blog post we just saw. In here I need to do several things. I need to run this JavaScript server, which is a simple Apollo server that takes information from Neo4j. And then I also have this schema that I generated from the Neo4j Graph database. So this schema and this server represents the Neo4j GraphQL API. And of course, this one is taking data from a Neo4j Graph database, which I'll show you in a bit. And then second, we have this StepZen GraphQL API that has introspected the Neo4j database and the GraphQL API that I've running locally on localhost, and I haven't run it just yet. I will do it in a bit. And then combine it with data coming from the New York Times API to get reviews specifically. And you can find samples on how to get this started all in this repo. So as I mentioned, the first step is to set up Neo4j, then to create a GraphQL API with the Neo4j GraphQL library, and then third, introspect this data using StepZen, and then 4 would be to add the New York Times API to it. First, let's have a look at our Neo4j database. You can create a free account for Neo4j by going to sandbox.neo4j.com, and after creating a new account or signing in with your existing account, you get a choice to create a new project or graph database based on a dataset. So the first featured dataset is called movies, and it's the one we'll be using for this example project. So you select movies, you go to create, and after pressing create, Neo4j will start setting up a new graph database based on the movies dataset. It will take some time, and the database will be available for 3 days only. So it will initialize the database, add all the data to it, after which you'll be able to connect to it. You can see there are multiple ways to connect to it. We'll actually be using these connection details. And it's perfectly fine if I share them on the screen with you, because I will be deleting this database directly after shooting the video. So this is my Neo4j database. I have it all running. What I need to do second is create a GraphQL API based on its contents. Back in VS Code, you can see I have a directory called Neo4j, and you can find the GraphQL schema in here. And this is because I already generated this schema by running whatever is in init.js and pointing it towards my Neo4j graph database. So this small script will generate the schema.graphql, which we just saw. And as you can find this full example in the GitHub repo for all these StepZen code examples, I'm not going to be regenerating it. Instead, I will be filling this data with my connect URL and my Neo4j password. I will be copying this, actually just duplicating, and I'll rename it to .environment. And then of course I need to insert my connect URL and Neo4j password. So after adding these values, and of course it's perfectly fine that I did not hide them, as I will be deleting this database right after. So by adding these credentials to the .environment file, and as we also have our server and the GraphQL schema generated, I can already start my Neo4j GraphQL API by running npm start. Actually, let me see, by running npm start indeed. So this will start my node server, which is right there, based on this GraphQL schema that you can generate by running npm generate. And the only thing I need to run is npm start. I probably need to install my dependencies first, as I just checked out this project from GitHub. So after installing all the packages, I'm able to run npm start. So this will start a new GraphQL API on localhost 4000. Of course, we can start to check out this GraphQL API, but we won't be doing it for this example. We'll be looking at the completed GraphQL API later on. So I have my GraphQL API running, and I'm going to leave it running. So I create a new terminal window, and from there, I will show you how to run StepZen. So you can install StepZen from npm by running npm install global, and then just type StepZen. I already done this. Let me double check it by seeing if I'm logged in. Oh, running StepZen Who am I? You can see I'm logged in and I have my keys available. So what I can do next is I can start my GraphQL API from StepZen, which is all in this file. You can see I still have a sample config.yaml, so I need to insert my API key from the New York Times. I'll be doing that in a bit because we can already start the GraphQL API before. For this, I'll be running StepZen locally using a Docker image, as our Neo4j GraphQL API is also running locally. So what I do, instead of running StepZen start, which is the usual command to start a StepZen GraphQL API, I'll be running StepZen service start. And this will use the Docker CLI to be installed, but it says it could not find it. So I need to make sure that I have Docker or something else running. So instead of Docker, you can also use Rancher. So excuse me for a second, as I will be starting up Docker. So after setting up Docker or a Docker equivalent, you can again run StepZen service start. This will take the Docker image and create a container. The first time you run this command, it might take a bit longer than you want to, as it needs to create these images and containers. So after creating all the containers, you need to re-log in. This time you're not logging in with your StepZen account. Instead, you use you're pointing StepZen login towards this local configuration file for working with the Docker container. I can just copy paste this command and run it right there. And now I'm successfully logged in with my local GraphQL account, which is using the Docker container. Meaning that I can actually start whatever I have in my schema here. If you look in the GraphQL files, you can see our queries are pointing towards a host.docker internal endpoint. So this is the equivalent of a local host for Docker. It's pointing towards port 4000, which is the same port that we have running here. So host.docker.internal port 4000/GraphQL is basically the same as HTTP localhost 4000. So it's pointing towards our Neo4j GraphQL API. So what I'm going to be doing, I'll be cding into the StepZen directory, and from there I can just start the GraphQL API by running StepZen start. I can see an issue, there's no local config YAML file found. Well, of course, stupid me. I need to copy paste this one and rename it to config.yaml. And as you can see, I won't be adding a value for the New York Times API yet. I will do this later on. So it will give us a few options to explore this API. We can either use a curl in the terminal, or we can go to this endpoint and try it out from a browser. And in your browser, you can find a local graphical and all the queries that we have. So we have a list of queries to get some movies. So let's see, we have title, tagline, year, release. If we query this, it will take the data from the Neo4j Graph database through the GraphQL API that we built using Neo4j's GraphQL library. But now it's all routing through StepZen. And we're routing this through StepZen as we want to combine this data with data from the New York Times REST API. And we can do this by adding the reviews fields. And we can get a byline and a headline which comes from Neo4j, which comes from New York Times. This is New York Times data, and this would be Neo4j data. But first, I need to make sure that I pass my New York Times API key through my StepZen config.yaml file. The New York Times has a developer portal in which you can find all the different REST APIs. And the one I'll be using for today is the Movie Reviews API. And I'll be using this Movie Reviews API to get reviews for all the movies that we have in our Neo4j Graph database. If you'd like to get your API key and stuff, you can just go through apps here, where you need to create a small application. So this is my movie test application, and through here, you can find my API key. I can also show my secret and my app ID. But for this video, I've blurred them to make sure that you won't be able to steal this information from me. Okay, so I'll be taking this API key and I'll be using it in my VS Code project in order to connect my New York Times REST API to the data from the Graph database. So I'll copy it here, I save it. My GraphQL API will automatically be redeploying to in the Docker container, and this should make it possible to combine my Graph database data with the data from the reviews here. So it's taking the New York Times REST API. You can see we add some variables there. We're looking at the release date and also the keyword, which would be the title, and the release date would be released. So from my localhost graphical, I'm now able to get the title, tagline, and released. So I'll be using a combination of the title and the release date to generate a list of reviews. Once I press run, it should not only get the data from my Graph database in Neo4j, but also from the New York Times REST API. And as you can see here, there's a review found for The Matrix, written by Janet Maslin. There's reviews for the movie The Matrix Revolutions, written by A.O. Scott, and you can also see the headline. So this is basically the title of the review. You can see some authors have been adding nice titles, while others haven't added too many titles. You can see there aren't titles for everything, as apparently, if I scroll down, I can see some error messages. I'm requesting too much data from the New York Times REST API. So what I'm going to do, I'll be limiting my data. I'm going to say limit is 3, meaning I only request 3 movies at a time. And once I rerun this, I should be able to get more reviews. Again, I get an error, too many requests, as apparently the New York Times REST API has very strict policies on getting too much data. And this is something you can easily fix yourself by either create a paying account or make sure that you optimize so you don't send too much REST requests through the StepZen GraphQL API. So that was all for the community update of June. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned new stuff, such as converting REST APIs to GraphQL using the StepZen dashboard, or using Neo4j and their Graph database to federate data across multiple GraphQL APIs together with StepZen, of course. And I hope you enjoyed this last collaboration, especially as we are looking to create more ways to sort of integrate Neo4j and StepZen to help developers build cool data-heavy applications. And finally, the final sneak peek I want to give you around StepZen and deployment options is that we're working on making StepZen available through the AWS Marketplace. And this is one of the cool things we're able to do since the acquisition of StepZen by IBM. So if you're building GraphQL APIs on AWS, make sure to keep an eye out for the StepZen social media channels so you can see whenever we launch this new integration on the AWS Marketplace. And with this, I'd like to end today's live stream, and I hope to see you again soon, which is for the live stream of next month in